Hey folks, this is David Williamson. I'm the with the American Statistical Association sometimes, and I'm with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention all the time. I'm here in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm welcoming you to our ASA Statistical Impact webinar. This is the second in our series of webinars, and many of you may remember that Dr. Karen Cafeter, when she was president in 2019, wanted us to think about an initiative on statistical impact. And so we've had a committee that got together over the last couple of years and it's been working hard on putting different pieces together. And one of the things that we came up with was this statistical impact webinar. And so before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and acknowledge the committee members. We had David Banks, Hormuz Kotke, Fred Hulting, Jerry Mulrow, Susan Paddock, Byron Smucker, and Jennifer Van Mullicom. Those were the committee members along with me, and Donna Lalonde was obviously an instrumental piece from our ASA staff in Alexandria. And one of the things that we came up with was this statistical impact webinar. This is our second in the series. The first one in the series was on automated driving systems, and that was a few weeks ago. And so this one is the second one in the series, and we're very pleased. You've got a great group of folks that are going to be presenting today for us. And I'll just remind you that one, we will be recording this, and two, as folks go through their presentations, take a minute and type your questions into the question and answer facility here on screen, and that'll give Donna and me a chance to take a look at the questions, and we'll have those on tap for our presenters. We have three wonderful presentations today. The overall theme of the impact series is to think about statistics and where we have not been able to make an impact yet. So these are areas in which are ripe for statistics to make a contribution and statisticians to make a contribution. And we also want to celebrate the areas in which statistics have already made a contribution or are in the initial thrust of making contributions. So that's what we want to talk about with our statistical impact webinar series. And today our series webinar title is COVID-19, Vulnerable Populations and Disinformation. It's a very timely presentation, and it's going to focus on research areas from the perspective of migrants and refugees. And so we have our first speaker with us today is Professor Liberty Vittert. She is a professor of the practice of data science at the Olin Business School at the Washington University in St. Louis, and she's also a senior fellow at the Harvard Data Science Initiative. She's also a feature editor for the Harvard Data Science Review. She is a celebrity. She has been on many TV and radio shows, including the Fox News Channel, US News, Newsweek, CBS News, Market Watch, Boston Globe, and on and on. And so we're very fortunate to have her with us today. She writes popular science books on data, and she is also on the board for the UN Refugee Agency, as well as the International Advisory Council for the UN Migration Agency. And so we're very fortunate to have her with us today, and her presentation title is The Incredible Impact of Statisticians as it relates to the UN. And it's really nice that we have all three of these speakers today, because all three of these speakers are critical to a symposium that's upcoming next week. It's called the World Migration and Displacement Symposium, May 11th through 13th. And I'm not going to steal anybody's thunder. I know all three of our speakers may mention that today, and I'd like to just go ahead and turn it over to you, Liberty, and take it away, okay?
Thank you so much, David. I'm gonna fire my publicist and hire you. I should just have you be my publicist right now.
I'd be happy to do it.
Well, thank you all so much for coming today. I'm so excited to do this. So much of my work has been in how we can apply statistics and data science to the humanitarian needs of refugees and migration. So I'm super excited to talk about some very specific projects that I've been lucky enough to work on, and where I will be asking you all if you would like to work on these projects. But first, I do need to do a plug for the World Migration and Displacement Symposium. It is this 3-day event that is next week. The link is right there, and I will put it in the chat later. But it's sort of the epitome of what statisticians can do for impact. It's bringing together statisticians and data scientists from NGOs, from academia, from industry, to all come together to talk about what the cutting edge research is on these 3 main topics, which is disinformation, vulnerable populations, and COVID-19. So I'm going to just very briefly give a plug for each one of these and just give you a feel for the kind of things that we're going to be talking about next week, which I really hope you will all join us for. So the first is our Disinformation Panel, and really sort of current predictions are that by the end of 2022, most people in mature economies will consume more fake news than accurate information through their digital media feeds. And this is a very particular problem for high profile and increasingly politicized policy issues, especially being ones such as migration and refugees. So one of the big topics that we'll be tackling in the Disinformation Panel is what are the new methodologies to combat fake news around these topics. Our second panel will be specifically on vulnerable populations. Vulnerable populations are some of the hardest to measure. I mean, one example is victims of human trafficking. Human trafficking and migration are very closely related, especially when migration is made out of necessity rather than choice. In the US alone, the State Department estimates anywhere between 15,000 and 100,000 women and children are trafficked each year. But we have no idea how to truly collect this information. There are methods that are being used, but we really need to get better at it. And that will be one of the major topics that is going to be discussed during the Vulnerable Populations panel. And finally, we have what all of us have been living through for the past year, which is COVID-19. There has been an enormous stop to migration due to COVID-19, and how are we sort of going to deal with that going forward? When it was before, it was, what's your name, where are your papers? It's now your body that's in question when you're immigrating or moving throughout space. So the big questions of how COVID-19 will affect migration for years to come and the movement of people. We also have a keynote, of course. Shali Meng, who is right here, will be doing a fireside chat with the Director General of the UN Migration Agency. And we also have one of the more incredible speakers I've ever heard. Tolu will be closing out with a keynote discussing her own story and her own immigration story, and why sort of, again, really what we're all here for today, why the impact is so important and what that really does for people's lives. So what I was hoping to talk about today was some really specific projects that I've gotten to work on with the Hive, which is the data advisory group for the UN Refugee Agency. And sort of the way it just all comes together by statisticians and data scientists who say, I'm really interested and I want to help. And these incredible projects have come out of that. The Hive was started in 2013, and it was specifically to try to figure out how to use data to help in the refugee crisis. One of the biggest issues is camps, refugee camps. Some 3 generations of people live in the same camp. There's this camp in Kakuma. There's 192,000 people that currently live there, and it's been growing over the past 30 years. You don't have any planning permission in a refugee camp. People put up structures, things change, things move, and we actually had no map of this camp. None. There was no map except the original one 30 years ago when there were 2,000 people in it. And you might say, well, why do you really need a map? And we'll get to that. But it allows for the placement of sanitation. Where do you need to put in water? Where do you need to put in bathrooms? How do you make inroads for supplies to get in? And we had no map of these camps. So a group of statisticians got together, cobbled 4 of them, and asked for them to give their time to figure out what we could do to do this. So the original goal was to figure out a way to make these logistic decisions by having these refugee camps, and also figure out a way to sort of engage the public on this. So the idea was to use some sort of machine learning method to be able to map these camps, but we originally needed a data set. And so these statisticians, this group of 4 statisticians, came up with a way to crowdsource the mapping of these camps for the training data. So they took over 100 refugee camps, and people tagged, like as a crowdsourcing method, over 690,000 structures. So you can see here the different regions over the 100 camps, the image counts of the satellite data, and the number of raw shelters that people actually went in and tagged from crowdsourcing data. And it has had this sort of incredible long-term impact of this one little project that 4 statisticians, after a lot of begging and pleading, decided to work on. In 2017, when it originally started, there was absolutely no external funding or resources, but with the demonstration of what we could do and the ability of mapping these camps, by 2021, it became a fully funded project by Microsoft, with everything from the purchase of the imagery to all of the data science and analysis methods and all of the computing support. And we're now moving from satellite imagery into drone imagery. And it's just this sort of incredible impact that's starting with this one little project. And, you know, the implications for this type of mapping are enormous. We talked about sanitation, but, you know, where do you put in streetlights so the girls who are going to school can walk home safely at night? There's just this incredible need. And now it's this huge, fully funded project after demonstrating the potential impact. So this is just one type of the many type of projects to get involved in. There was another one that we did, you know, sort of talking about overall where this humanitarian need comes from. You know, there's 80 million people currently that are forcibly displaced worldwide. 26.3 million of them are refugees. This is only a growing crisis. So one of the discussions we had starting a couple years ago was, where do we get the money to fund this gap? UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency's budget is $8 billion, and they only got $3 billion last year. So where do we get the extra $5 billion to support this growing number of refugees? The general idea is you get governments to give money, and how do you do that? You show them that it'll save them money in the long term. Businesses, you show them how it's going to help their businesses. And I'm going to argue to you over the next couple minutes that the way you get the public to give money is by finding and telling good statistical stories. And I'm not going to steal Scott's thunder, because I know he's going to talk a little bit about moving from political donors to charitable donors. But that was this idea here of using the same methodology that people use to get voters to get donors. So I'm going to focus for this particular study that we did on the refugee crisis, although there is an entire immigration crisis happening. But I'm going to show you a pretty disturbing photo next. It was all over the news in 2015, but I just wanted to warn you before I show it to you, because it's a really upsetting photo that was all over every news channel in 2015. So just to warn you. This is the photo that sparked the world's knowledge and understanding of the refugee crisis. This is Alan Kurdi. He was a 3-year-old Syrian child. His family were escaping Syria. They were on the shores of Turkey, trying to take a smuggler's boat to the island of Lesbos in Greece. There were 22 people piled into a boat that was only supposed to hold 6. They paid $5,000 for 4 seats, and 5 minutes out into the water of a 30-minute journey to Lesbos, the boat obviously capsized with having so many people in it. And Alan Kurdi, at 3 years old, was found drowned on the beach in Turkey. And this is the photo that made the entire world wake up to the Syrian refugee crisis. It is sort of as tragic and as heartbreaking and overwhelming as you can possibly imagine of a photo. But I'd like to ask you all a question of how long do you think donations to the UN Refugee Agency increased after the release of this photo on every major news channel in the world? If you just think to yourself, I don't know how the chat works at the moment, but how long you think the donations increased after the release of this picture? Usually people say 1 week, 2 weeks, a couple months. Donations increased for 22 hours and then stopped. 22 hours was how long donations increased, and then they went right back down to the normal level. The single most heart-wrenching, horrible story any person could possibly imagine, 22 hours. People lose track. People move on, their lives move on, and these stories and these images clearly don't stay with them. So our question was, what do we need to do to get these stories to stay with people so that they continue to support refugees? And what we found is the way to do this, the way to make people care long term, the way to make people remember and make people want to have impact on refugees or any charity in that state, is to tell good statistical stories. And why do we believe that? We did a survey with Civis Analytics of what works and what doesn't for the American people. What about refugees would increase or decrease someone's affinity for the cause? So I'll ask you, if we for this survey, we told the people in the survey, refugees undergo stringent security checks. Do you think that increased or decreased Americans' affinity for the refugee cause? Decreased people's affinity for the cause because it reminded them that there was a security issue in the first place. What about refugees more likely to graduate college and secure jobs than non-refugees? Just think to yourself for a minute if you think that increased or decreased the affinity for the cause. Interestingly enough, it decreased Democratic support and increased Republican support. Nearly half of refugees are children. Increased support all the way around. Albert Einstein was a refugee. Everybody loves Einstein. It increased all support. We did a specific test on Catholics, 60 million displaced, 21 million fleeing their homes, or Jesus was a refugee. The first had no change in support, and the second had a large increase. So now you're saying, well, Liberty, you said telling good statistical stories and using numbers really changes the way people feel, but this 60 million displaced and 21 million fleeing did nothing, and it changed no support. And that's because it's not a story, it's just a number. What was clear from all of the surveys that we did was there is a global refugee crisis, doesn't work, no one cares. But if this is the way it impacts you and what you care about, we can create true impact and true donors for the long term. So how did we do that? During the Major League Baseball playoffs, we ran these ads. Instead of saying 42,000 new people flee their home every day on a daily basis, we put the stadium of whatever city the advertisement was going out in, we put that stadium in there and showed a picture of the stadium that you were just watching on TV while you were watching this Major League Baseball game and said that is the number of people who flee their home on a daily basis. In this case, it was the Minute Maid Park of the Houston Astros. We had 100,000 new long-term donors. Or for the LGBTQ plus community, we did rainbow refugees, so putting real numbers to the issues facing the LGBTQ plus community around the world. And we had 200,000 new recurrent donors from this. As soon as you are able to tell a statistical story around what people truly cared about, you were able to create a long-lasting, deep care for whatever project we were working on. The public truly does love good statistical stories, and it can have incredible impact on all of these issues. So what I would like to leave you all with before Scott and Shali talk further about this is that there is incredible work for statisticians to do in this field, and that if you have any interest, please let me know. We are always looking for people to help on different projects that might be interesting to you, and who can tell where they can go in these really incredible, weird ways. So whether that's for refugees or for immigration, I would love to hear from you. And if you would like to help or donate your time, we need you. And there is incredible work to be done. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Liberty. Very inspiring presentation. I'm wondering, do we have time for a couple of questions? Are there questions from participants?
I don't see any yet, David, so maybe we could move on to Scott. And
that's always the fear when you ask for questions from the audience, and that's that moment of fear. That's when you plant questions. But don't worry, Scott and Shali, I'll ask questions.
There is a request. Can you put the link about the conference next week?
Yes, of course.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and move on. Our second presenter is Scott Tranter. He is the co-founder of Optimus. That is a data and technology company based in Washington, D.C. And he and his team of information architects include TV targeting platforms and machine learning workflows and conducting in-cycle experiment-informed activation programs. Things that I'm not even sure what they mean, Scott. So I'm not sure whether you're going to talk about some of those things, but I do know what you are going to talk about, and that is fundraising methods. And it's a perspective from the political realm. And from what I understand, you're going to be referring to machine learning and how that's related to the UN experience.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks for that kind introduction, and thanks for having me today. I am, for those in the audience, I always like speaking to practitioners. I am proof positive that you can get a C- in statistics in high school and still come out and employ some of these tactics in the real world. Just 2 seconds of background. You mentioned Optimus, and so we're about 20 people, lots of engineers, lots of stats backgrounds, and we do a lot of different data science projects. And what I like to say is people ask us, they come to us with a problem, and we use data science to solve it. And it's funny, I'll never forget when we first started this industry, we were building a model for someone, and someone said, you know what, I don't really trust all this data science thing, especially this logistic regression thing. I think that's all BS. I don't believe in it. But you guys are using this thing called XGBoost, and I really buy into it. And I didn't really key into them. I'm like, these are all the same things, and one's not real, the other. But gives you an idea of where someone like me comes into the industry. Is most people don't really understand what it is we do. And when I say we, it's everyone on this phone call, right? We're all in the STEM background type of stuff. And so that's where I think the rubber meets the road with stuff like this, is how do we take our expertise and really improve upon some real world problems. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about today, and I think everyone, you'll live longer if you don't pay attention to politics. That's what I like to say. But one of the things that kind of came out of this is how much money politics raises. And everyone thinks it's because it's TV personality and it's craziness, but there is a lot of math and science behind how, both Democratic, Republican, and non-political people fundraise. And what I found with working with Liberty and the UNHCR is they hadn't employed a lot of these techniques. And so just to kind of set the table, if you look at just in the last 12 months, the vast majority of Republican and Democratic donors have been from individuals, right? And so, there's 320 million Americans who are eligible to give to a political campaign. How do you understand who is the person who's willing to give $500 online versus $50 online? How do you find the person who would give $50, but they just need to be encouraged how to. And so that's where the data science comes in, and where these campaigns have been very good. And we can see this in some of the stats that have come out of recent elections, is that you've had these people like Beto O'Rourke raise $60 million for a Senate race. The funny stat out of that is about 40 million of that was not from people inside the state of Texas. In other words, he got $40 million from people who believed in his campaign who didn't live in the state of Texas. And that wasn't because Beto O'Rourke was on CNN every day, or, you know, showing up to a coffee klatch in Los Angeles, California, or something like that. It was because he had really good data science behind it, so he could identify who those donors were and then figure out the right thing to say to them to get it. And so that kind of sets the table of, you know, what's possible out there when you use this. And then the question becomes is, okay, well, how do we apply that into the UN and stuff like that? And really what it is you know, the same way politicians do. You have to build up databases, and you have to build up specific databases, and then understand what motivates these people and what their capacity to give is. You know, Obama's donor list contained 13 million names. Bernie Sanders had 5 million. Trump's donor list was 20 million. And again, I posit to you, there's about 320 million Americans eligible to give in political campaigns. So it's not like these people were hitting every person in America. They were literally trying to find not necessarily a needle in a haystack, but maybe a large nail in a haystack. And so you don't want to spend more money than you gain trying to find some of these people. And so that's where developing these donor lists are crucial. And we started working with UNHCR, and I work also with USA IOM. We found these donor lists were not very big. That, you know, UNHCR does not have a 20 million person email address list they can go to do their fundraising lists. And build upon that. And so what we worked is we went out and did a survey, we did a survey, as well as we took a list of known UN donors, and we matched that against a consumer file. I don't know if that scares anyone, but it's, you know, if you're a statistician like all of us are, it kind of makes you excited that you have all this clean data around. We have a list of all 320 million Americans. And we have their names and their addresses, and then we append on census data. If there's any census people on there, the American Community Survey is spectacular data, just getting refreshed in the last 6 months. And so we have all that information, which makes for great independent variables. And so then we can look at people who are already giving or who are likely to give, because they indicate by giving the pass or tell us that on a survey, and use that as a dependent variable so that we can create a list of prospects. And again, the whole point here is we want to be better than just a random advertising campaign to give to the UN. We want to make sure we find those 5-10 million people who are ready to give, because we know not all 320 million Americans were. And so what we do is we use machine learning methods. We do this all in Python, scikit-learn. So for those of you just getting into it, really, you know, we're big Python fans here, especially scikit-learn, because you can play around with a lot of different tree-based estimators, ensemble approaches. We're big fans of ensemble approaches. Why pick one algorithm when you can just, you know, put them all, try them all, and then average them together. And then once data is accumulated, we can continue to refresh that model as that model is used and more people donate. So it kind of gets smarter as it goes along. And that's the project we did for UNHCR, the Hive, which is the UN's data science arm last year. And they're currently using those lists right now. My understanding is they're well on their way to, you know, their first 100,000 donors. You know, on their way to getting into 5 to 10 million, which is where we go. And that's what I like to call it's basically an endowment, a nonprofit endowment, because that email list will, you know, we find, and I'll talk about this in a minute, through randomized control group tests and message A/B testing on the message side, we find that, look, if you say certain things or give some sort of feedback to these donors, you can turn a $50 donor into a $75 donor. You can turn a $75 donor into a $500 donor. You can really use these people or develop these people to really buy into the effort and the organization, and then continue to give going on and forward. And that's one thing I want to highlight. It's not just modeling and then give a list. There's a lot of testing done on the other side, randomized control group tests, right? Like, what kind of message do we send them? Do we send them a message that says, you know, give now because of that picture that Liberty showed? Or do we send them a lot of non-asks, like give them updates on UNHCR, and then 6 months in, then do we make the ask, right? And we all know this on this call. There's, you know, it's not just some random, what's my idea today? You can set up tests and trials and you can set it up in a way in which you can statistically measure what's the best way. And those are important, right? Just because we learn something works on a political campaign does not mean it'll work in the nonprofit world. And that's why everyone's list, it's almost like it's not one set of studies that tells us what to put in an email. Each organization has to do its own set of randomized control group tests to understand what some of their lists, how to really make the most of their lists. Just to give you an idea of what some of these outputs look like, or how good some of these models are. This was a model we had done for them, likely to have a refugee-friendly worldview, right? Like that's a first opinion thing that you have to have. You want someone who has a refugee-friendly worldview, and that's fertile ground to go after people to might ask them for money. And you can see here, and I'm sure this is not proprietary or anything, but this is what our head of data science and his team put together after doing the model is, calibration chart's okay. Might get a B plus in stats class, decent AUC, decent score distribution. But the big important thing here, which the UN liked, which again, not necessarily hugely statistician focused, they're like, great, you told us that there are 320 million people who could potentially give to an organization. That's really expensive to go ask and talk to all of them and ask them to give money. You just took a list of 320 million and narrowed it down to 10 million. Right? So we can take our finite budget and really focus on that and start building the list from there. I think this is a perfect example where we can use some techniques, from the stats world, and we can use it to help the UN solve a problem. Their problem was we need to build a donor list, and we don't have a big enough budget to talk to 320 million people. We've got a big enough budget where we can talk to 10 million people to start building that list. If we build that list will give us money, and that becomes a recurring revenue in which we can fund our operations. We actually we didn't talk a whole lot about data science with them when we worked with them on this. It wasn't selling data science. It was their problem was they needed to have a donor list, and they want to know the smartest way to do it. We brought the rigor of data science and stats to it. And I think that's a good example of how you can take what we all do together, on a daily basis and really, help out an organization like the UN. And it's not like something we invented. There isn't anything we invented here. I did not invent XGBoost. I did not invent, using some of these techniques in the nonprofit world. We saw something someone else was doing, and we decided to apply it to a real world problem. I think that's the takeaway I would leave with everyone on here, and what, going forward is you don't have to invent a new algorithm. You don't have to invent or, pioneer or publish. It's, taking what we're really good at and then seeing if we can use that as a tool to fix some everyday problems. So with that, I'll end, but any questions I can answer. Oh, I see a question. I notice I sometimes get solicitations from the same political candidate with different wording at my separate residence. What is happening? Is the candidate testing different wording? Absolutely. I would say not every time. Sometimes that's just bad data, but absolutely. If you are a registered voter in America and you have voted sometime in the last 10 years, I guarantee you've been part of a randomized control group study, and most likely one that I've done, especially if you live in a state like Florida, Ohio, Texas, California, or Iowa. But if it's not me, it's someone else. This is, politics probably has more randomized control group study tests, not necessarily as many as in medicine, but more of that kind of stuff is done than most people realize. Mostly because people like us don't have IRB boards. No one's running this by anyone with ethics. It's probably a problem too.
Scott, this is Karen Kaffler. If wouldn't bore the participants too much, could you say a little bit more about exactly how you used the, say, logistic regression? Was that to try to find the variables that predicted a donor from a non-donor, or a big donor from a little donor? And how did you use machine learning there? Were you trying to predict the dollar amount that would be given?
Yeah.
But I mean, and especially with machine learning, how did you decide what variables mattered, and how did you use them? Logistic regression,
Great.
Know what model looks like, but what did you do with those variables that came out of the machine learning algorithm?
Sure. So great question. So let me break down, and I apologize if I missed one. We do primarily binary classification. So what we're trying to do is provide a score, a probability score, right? So the model you're looking at here is basically us saying, hey, there are 10 million people, and you can see the KS chart here. that tells us, all the people we can take on a score. So what I will tell you is not all 10 million of those people will definitely have a refugee-friendly worldview, but someone in there might have a 65% chance of aligning with that view. And a 65% chance, man, that's better than a coin flip. And if you look at what the UN's trying to solve here is they're like, look, we know there's 320 million people. Instead of randomly going after all of them, give us a priority list. And so do a lot of binary classification. Once we get data on, hey, this person gave $10 and this person gave 55, then we could do another round of modeling to figure out, okay, who are the people, who should we ask for $50 from and who should we ask for $10 from? And again, so there's some, multivariate classification there. What we use for independent variables is we maintain, and it's something everyone can get. You can go by, if I'm sure a lot of us remember the white pages, right? The white page is basically a list of everyone's name and phone number and address. So imagine the white pages, and then we take the US Census American Community Survey and we slap that on there. And then all of a sudden we have things like, what their education is, what the value of their home is, how many people in their household, all that kind of stuff. We have usually a few hundred independent variables. Then we can go out and buy some more independent variables, things like what their credit score is, how old their kids are, which make for good independent variables. And then that's what we use. We do a lot of PCA because, as you can imagine, if you have a couple of hundred independent variables, there's a lot of noise in there. We actually do a lot of feature engineering too, where we will, look at location and things like that to create our own features. But there's a lot of testing involved, right? Like there's a lot of playing around with the data because the model that's good for here, all the independent variables that are good for this model are probably not good if we're doing, say, a model for, the U.S. Wildlife Fund. And so that's where the data scientists really get to play around with the data.
Thank you, Scott. That was
Did I answer your question?
yeah, that was very interesting. I mean, I imagine part of it is just subject matter expertise. You've got 100 variables and you see that these 16 all kind of relate to education or SES in some form. So
Correct.
you develop a composite or something like that. Yeah. Correct.
As you can imagine in this variable, and I probably should have prepared it, but we can get ethnicity codes from the U.S. Census data. And so they're not great, but they're at least consistently applied. And so as you can imagine, if you have an ethnicity code that's, say, non-white Hispanic or African American or something like that, guess what's relatively predictive for having a refugee-friendly worldview? And then you combine that with maybe someone's education and someone's income bracket, and then all of a sudden you start finding that you have some pretty predictive variables about who might be good at being donors, or just be open to being donors.
Do people care much about, and then I'm going to shut up so that Charlie can, do people care much? Do they pay much attention to what proportion of their donation actually goes to the cause versus administration?
So it's funny, we have run a lot of, that's where some of the A/B test comes in, right? Like, do you mention that up front, or do you not mention that? And what we have found is, and I haven't seen one specifically for the UN, but I have seen some randomized control group studies for some other nonprofits that is highly predictive of someone giving money, especially early on. Right? Like if this is the first time they're giving to an organization, like first time donors, they really care about that. If they've been giving to you for 3 years, like that message isn't real, that's not a real powerful message. But the only way I know, right.
Anymore, because they assume it hasn't changed, right?
Yeah. And the only reason why I know that is because someone literally took, I can't disclose which nonprofit, but I imagine you guys would know it. Some nonprofit took their email list of 500,000, and then they took their prospect list of 250,000, and they ran, they constructed a randomized control group study, and they planned it all out. And they came up with the answer, and it was interesting. And it was funny. It was a social scientist who came up with this, right? Like I consider myself a social scientist, not necessarily a full stats person, right? You have a lot of social scientists, coming from maybe the softer side of things, employing what, some of you biostatisticians, spend 10 years going to school for. We're lifting a lot from what you guys do, and trying to apply it to some of these social problems, which I think is a good thing, right? Like I talk to a lot of people. Like we have a couple of kids. I call them kids, but they're post-grad students in the biostats. And we have a person from physics, and they're like, well, how can I take my knowledge and really apply it to what you do, which is, it sounds like it's the softer side of business. I said, look, we're lifting a lot of the things that you spent the better part of your life studying and trying to engineer a way to apply them to everyday life. The math is roughly the same. It's just how we apply it. And so if you can be creative along those lines, you have application, you could be a theoretical physicist and really making a difference in something like this.
Thank you, Scott.
Sure.
Scott, I have to ask you just to do a little plug for our World Migration and Displacement Symposium. Could you tell everybody what the survey is that you've done for this and sort of give an idea of this really cool survey that you guys have put in?
Sure. So, and it's still in the field, so I don't know if it's going to be. I don't want to get too far ahead of it. But what we're looking at is how disinformation. How disinformation affects public opinion. And actually, there's a lot of, even if our survey doesn't show anything, there's a lot of great work done by Pew. There's a lot of great survey information done by the Nag Ritter Foundation, and there's a lot of good research out there. But really understanding where people's opinions dividing lines come on when they believe or not believe news and information out there. And as you can imagine, in fact, Pew did a great study on it, or continues to do good studies on it, where they showed that, look, I don't think it'll surprise anyone here, is what news you believe or what information you believe largely aligns with your political opinions. But it also largely aligns with who you think is credible, right? And so, you would probably think a close family member or friend is credible, or at least that's what I originally thought when some of this is, but we're finding a lot of studies show that they don't, people think the people who most people find most credible are not necessarily people they know, which isn't necessarily a good thing. That's a nice way of me saying is there are some people who believe the guy on TV at 8 o'clock more than they believe their spouse, which I found fascinating in some of this research. But it's, really looking at how public opinion forms around disinformation and things like that. And I think that'll be an interesting thing. And honestly, unfortunately, probably a topic we're going to be addressing for the next 5 or 10 years. Anything else I can answer for folks? My last plug I will make for you is social science, which is where we come from, really needs more smart statisticians and smart engineering, because we've got a lot of problems to solve. And, especially with the UN and things like that, there's a lot of practical applications for all this kind of stuff. So the more people we can get, on this side of the field, I think the better the world gets.
Okay. Scott, thank you so much. Great, another great presentation. And we have in the cleanup position today, Dr. Xiao-Li Ming of Harvard University. He is the Whipple V.N. Jones Professor of Statistics there in the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences. He is the founding editor-in-chief of the Harvard Data Science Review. Many of you probably recognize that he was the former chair of the Department of Statistics there at Harvard, as well as the former dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences there. In 2001, he was named the best statistician under the age of 40 by the Committee of Presidents of Statistical Societies. He's received numerous awards, has more than 150 publications, more than 400 presentations and public speeches, and he is the author of what we know as a very entertaining column in the Institute of Mathematical Statistics Bulletin. That column is called the XL Files. And so Dr. Ming, I know he's going to talk to us a little bit about the Harvard Data Science Review and its relations with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and also something that's extremely important that we all as statisticians think about and want to know how to use, and that is citizen data project. That is, how do citizens help us collect data? So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to you, Xiao-Li. Thank you, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, David. I first want to check, does my screening looks okay? Because I have this multiple thing. Is that you only see one screen there? Okay, and
looks great.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Donna, and Karen, that all great friends that invite me, and I really, really appreciate it. I want to thank Liberty and Scott, obviously, and I want to say that it has been so much fun for me trying to convert myself from a statistician to be a data scientist. One of the benefits is to meet a lot more new friends. I don't think I knew neither Liberty nor Scott only a few years ago, and now I know them really quite well. And three of us are pretty dangerous together. That's a different story, but I will continue this presentation. I'm really wearing two hats today. Hats become increasingly important for me as I'm losing more hair. That one is I'm the editor-in-chief of Harvard Data Science Review, and I want to talk a little bit about like how we got involved with UN, particularly support us co-organize this workshop. I would really encourage everyone to attend next week. It's truly mind-boggling in terms of how many things we can do and how low they are as hanging fruits. I think that's one of the key message I want to convey. The second part is really as myself as a statistician that I want to tell you a little bit of a connection I have with UN simply coming out of giving one talk. And so my whole point today is really that there are lots of great things you can do that have literally global impact, but all you have to do is doing something quite local. And so I think that's something we should, we can all work on. So let me first just really a plug for the Harvard Data Science Review itself, that if you have not seen it, it's entirely free, open online. You can Google or whatever the browser you use. And we did get this, surprisingly, we got this best new journal in science, technology, medicine. I did not even know such big awards existed, so I was very pleased to get it. And I also want to say that if you are one of those, like myself, still like to read the hard copy, that it's for limited time. It's all online, that for $25. Now I'm like doing commercial now, and we even putting a free commemorative issue. So this is the cover page of that printed version. But the key point I want to mention about the Harvard Data Science Review is really this platform we created, and we have the slogan called the everything data science for everyone, and we literally means that for everyone. And one of the things that from day one that I wanted to having this platform to cover is obviously we reach out to industry, to government, but then of course, let's don't forget this whole NGO space. And there was a particular reason that I want to reach out to NGO space. Not only that's obviously impacts so many people's life, because even from the data science perspective, you will see, or from statistical perspective, that the NGO space has particular challenges. And I will get to a little bit later. So I guess many of you probably will be wondering what is data science, and I couldn't help to share with you this kind of anecdote, a very clever way of defining data science that got me a good laugh, but also good kind of reflection on it. This is about 2 or 3 years ago. This is just before the COVID-19. So 2 years ago, I was invited to join international dialogues on AI. Now, that's another loaded term, right? What is AI? Okay, but I'm not going to get into that. But I just want to tell you that in that particular conversation, this dialogue, one of the speakers put the first slides, and I to this day I still don't know whether this was a joke or this was a real kind of anecdote. What he said was that there was this clever university trying to advertise their computer science major to the undergrad, trying to get the people to into the computer science. So this line they use is say, if you want to solve all the problems in the world, major in computer science. Okay. Now, when he put that together, you know how I reacted, or any statistician would react, say, wait a minute. What about all the statisticians, right? And the scholar would react, what about all the social scientists? Like, and anybody would be reacting. But, this guy was clever. He's just, wait, okay. So the same university, then they advertised to try to attract people into their graduate programs. And then they wrote, but if you want to solve all the problems that are created by computer science, enrolled in graduate program in Faculty of Arts and Sciences, right? So what that meant is really that if you think about, it's actually really true that we have data science now, it's just really because we have computer, right? The AIs, all the internet, everything we're doing, it's not possible. Collecting vast majority of data is not possible without the computer. But the computer science itself, the computer itself has created essentially all kinds of problems, right? It's not a computer science create the problem, it's because the opportunity they provided allow us to deal with all kinds of problems. And that's, this really shows that the scope of the data science is literally kind of what I call the data science ecosystem. Essentially is really everything that, involving quantitative, investigation. But if you think about this broader view of data science, that you can't help but think about, like, places like the UN, the type of problem they work on, migration, refugee, all those things, are really the kind of shining examples why we need to think this thing incredibly broadly, right? Because the migration issue is really a fundamental issue in terms of human, ecosystem, but they create the kind of problems is also a fundamentally challenging problem for the for the data science, for the data science ecosystem. And again, I will return to that theme, in a minute. So I want to just tell you that how did I got into connected with UN? I got connected into UN and really through two directions. One of them is thanks to Liberty here. Liberty is the one that brought me, connect with UN and help to organizing this symposium coming next week. The other angle, I was really just I was invited last year. It is last year. I think it was just before the COVID-19. This was my last kind of trip outside, Boston before shutdown. I was invited to attend this one-day workshop, give a keynote speech to this one-day workshop. Essentially, on the household surveys in the era of changing data landscape, challenge, opportunities, and an agenda for the future. Specifically, the reason I was invited was because of an article, and again, I just thank Karen, because she was the editor and published my 2018 article. And quite a few of you probably know that because I've given this talk many times about the issue of data quality, how do you index data quality? And I used the 2016 election data, which I think because of that, I even sent a copy to Scott. I assume Scott has read it, memorized everything, but that's a test separately. And but because this work, and somehow the UN noticed, and they want me to speak to one particular issue. And the moment that they invite me, I say, yes, I'm going to deliver the message. Because this workshop itself had many heads of countries or regions. These are the statistical agencies. I think there was 140 participants in this particular workshop. Many of them are the chief statisticians or the head of the statistical agency. And they have one question, and I think that this question probably is dear to heart to all the statisticians. They basically want to ask is, like, in this era of big data, do we still need to do surveys? Do we still need to collect? Do we still need to spend money on working on these, time-consuming household surveys? Can we just use all the administrative data to address a lot of policy questions? And I guess you guys probably would know what my answer would be. And my answer was unequivocal. Absolutely, you still need to do everything that in terms of survey, because it is a high-quality surveys that give you the benchmark of the real data, right? And then this just shows that this was I was the keynote, and then there was this whole panel. You will see it really covers all kinds of agencies, around the world. Let me just show you this. Oops, this happens. Let's see, because there is a link to this. Is my internet down, or is because okay? This is another one. Let me see if I can still do this. If not, I'm just going to go on. Okay, it works. All right. Can you guys see the UN Web TV page? Okay, this is clearly not me. This is the Ola. She's the president of the Palestinian Statistical Agency, but I think she was on the same panel. I just want to show you, this was really my first UN presentation, and so far I was thinking of probably my most impactful presentation. But I just want to show you a slide saying I was actually there. Okay, this is the kind of a moment that I want to share with you. And okay, that was me. So I'm actually. So it was quite interesting to address this UN crowd, and I'm, of course, I'm not going to go on with this. So you're welcome to watch it if you want. But essentially, what I delivered the message was really they're using this example. I estimated the quality from the 2016 elections and show how hard it is trying to compensate the defect in data quality by increasing the data increasing the data size. And later this story gets picked up by Bloomberg Business Week, and I think that's where I actually send this link, I think, to Karen, to others. I rarely do that, and Karen can tell you, but I couldn't help in this particular case to tell Karen and others, say, hey, I say, I just gave one talk, and the UN people and was telling me, and in fact, this Bloomberg Business Week wrote about, I think that my talk did have an impact. I think by now there rarely is any talk about not doing survey anymore, and that's I think that was just quite, to me, it's a very heartwarming, for me, just give out as a talk, but it depends on where you give the talk and what's the message. And, I just say as Liberty was emphasizing how important it is to tell a statistical story. And Peter Coy, who is the editor of the economics in the Bloomberg Business Week, he's a terrific editor. He wrote this piece, and look how clever his title is. And that's the thing, you will get people's attention. But Karen, I have to tell you that is the most incredible thing, and you can shame these reviews of annual applied statistics. Peter actually found there was I missed one number in that article. Like after the decimal, actually I had extra 9 instead. So he actually said, that 9 shouldn't be there, right? And I double checked, he was right. It was.
I'm usually pretty good at finding that.
I know.
Gosh,
It was just incredible. This, the other reason I want to mention the story is that when you have these very serious journalists, that they really take. He actually listened to some of my talks. He read my article. He even checked my mathematics. So when he wrote this piece of article, I said, "You really did a better job than I could have done myself." And I think we need. By the way, Karen, this is the kind of a journalist that we should give the ASA, whatever. Journalist award, because they truly take a time, do the right thing. Think about combat disinformation. When I have more of those kind of a journalist, we're in a much better shape, right? So again, this is just this is how I start to get connected with this this statistical agency in this UN. And what's interesting is, just last week, okay, so the next few slides I got it just coming from the same group, because then they later contact me and we started having follow-up conversations, and they clearly appreciate even just give one talk, but they say, well, can you do more for us? I say, well, I'm really already having 2 full-time jobs, being a professor and editing this journal, but I say anything I can help, well, let's have a conversation. Once I started having the conversation, I started to realize, hey, I actually really still can help them, because they have so many problems what I consider is really low-hanging fruit from the kind of statistical perspective. They are not trivial. They're not easy at all for other reasons, okay? But the one thing I want to talk to you all, think this is about impact, and I think this is where statisticians or data scientists or whatever you want to call yourself, as long as you call yourself as a citizen, and I hope you will, that you can help here, okay? So what I learned from them is there's 2 kinds of called a citizen science data project. And they really taught me, and again, when I ask them, they even say, okay, they say, well, this is not really well defined, but this is the way they understood. And particularly these 2 individuals in this bottom, I thank them, Hao-Yi Chen, and the other person, I don't even remember the name, Yong-Yi Ming, right? And so, so the citizen science data are these kind of projects that these data are collected for government science projects. So these projects are already there, but the government needs to engage the citizen because they can't do everything on their own. And in fact, there's very, very good reason to do those things, that people not only would love to volunteer, save government the money, they do even better job. For example, one example I was given, right, is bird watchers that identify birds at certain locations. They want to study, biodiversity, all those things. But think about all the people love to do bird watch, right? Because they do it because it's a hobby. But tell them, like, hey, you're also helping a governmental science project, it really motivates people, right? And it's just it's a win-win, it's a win-win situation. There's a very good article here. Let me see if I can launch this one. See if this, the FOBA has this really interesting article about citizen science provides useful data for sustainable, for these SDOs, Sustainable Development Goals of UN. And there's a particular article I will show you later. I think it's really worthwhile doing. I have not finished it myself because I got all those things just last week. Another great example is from there's something called Earth Observation Organization. They're like a test air and water qualities, and government project, but get citizens involved. This one is really quite interesting. It's trying to report this marine litter, and I did not even know, right? I did not even know there is this group. This is a hosting is called the Litter Intelligence. Okay, you would never know that there's such thing called the litter intelligence, right? But it's really quite serious that because there are all these things causing tons of pollutions, and in fact that this particular website is a call you to get involved to become a litter data collector, right? You can see that you can do those things now, but as a statistician, you start to immediately say, holy cow, there are some serious problem you need to work on. People collect the data because whatever they can do. How do you know these data are not biased in some way, right? There's a huge selection bias by definition. Okay, so how do you, if the government is collecting them, you want to get a sense of either the overall picture or do policy makings? How do I know that we're not being kind of nobody's fault because everybody's trying to participate? But how do you do all these data data quality control? And I think that we statisticians can really do a lot. And but there's also a different kinds of citizen science data. It has a different term, which I did not know until last week. It's called a citizen-generated data. That should be probably generated data. These are like data produced by a local community for its own purpose. They may not even realize they are collecting data, but they have a particular purpose need to serve. Along the way, they actually have these data available, right? The particular example UN gave to me said there's an NGO organization that they develop an app and ask a woman suffering from domestic violence to reach out for help. But now, by doing so, because they have the app, right, they actually have the data on this kind of domestic violence. You know how hard it is to collect these data, right? Because the people want to conceal. But by having these apps, they were not developed for the purpose of like analyzing the situation. This is for helping people. But at the same time, the data were available, right? Now again, the whole issue is this could be very useful data, but the data quality is a big issue here, right? Talking about selection bias, okay? Because this is by definition, there's selection bias. Now the question is that if you think hard about, and there are, the UN told me there are more countries, particularly these are the, these underdeveloped countries, they are thinking about more and more to rely on the individual groups, communities to collect data because the government itself that may or may not have that capacity. You also need to think about in those kind of environment that how do you prevent special interest group for good reason or for bad reasons create the data for advance their agenda. Now it could be really great, it could be also be bad, or sometimes it's well intended, but there's always a competing of resources. I always want to share people with this following real anecdote. This is many years ago. When I was still in Chicago, I have a hobby to watch lots of TV, partly is to practice my Chinglish. And one day I was watching the TV. There was a Dan Rather. I think probably some of you still remember him on CBS. Was giving this quite shocking number. He was talking about the poverty level in US then, and saying data shows 40% of US kids are under the hunger level, okay? And I was sitting there, I said, wow, that sounds, that's not impossible, but just sounds extraordinary, has 40%. I certainly didn't expect it would be 40%. So I started thinking about, okay, there gotta be something wrong. I don't know how they asked the question. Of course, I would never find out. so funny was like a week later, because I watch a lot of TV just to prove to you, a different station, I forgot it was NBC and ABC, had a program particularly talking about the kind of how these data was collected but mislead people. And this was used as an example in the other program. They probably already teamed up. They was waiting for Dan Rather to talk about. And then they revealed that the question was that they got the 40% data was phrased, if I remember still correctly, the following way. They asked these kids like, do your parents ever need to limit the amount of food you want to have? Okay, so if you said yes, it would be so you're below the hunger level. Now, of course, I use this example in my class, and everybody get a good laugh and say, of course, we all said, I'm hungry. Now, somebody actually said, well, Charlie, yes, this might be a misleading, but it's for good cause, right? Because, this was actually by a kind of a, what do you call, American Against Hunger, or some organization did the surveys. So it's kind of for very good cause, which I agree. But on the other hand, we all understand there's only this limited amount of resources, right? If you do something like, too extreme, even for good cause, you are taking away resources, attentions, everything from everybody else. It's just like a very tiny example that you need to think about when you have this kind of a citizen general data, or even citizen science data, which is a little bit better because you have an organization there. There are lots of issues that the statistician can definitely come in. Not really anybody has any intention to mislead, but just because they don't know how to collect the data could have caused lots of problems, right? So this was a slide literally given to me by UN, because they talk about how these citizen data science project, citizen generated data, is related to these SDGs. And particularly, this was the article, I think this is the first of this kind. It's just published last July. Is they're mapping the citizen science contribution to the UN SDGs. They look at, I think there's 244 indicators, and this is a really long article, and 15, 16 pages. That it's a great. I just started to read it. I think I would encourage you. It's complete, open access. But here's the interesting picture. Shows like how many things we can still do. Now, this is about all science, not just the data science. But what they show is that they show the data by different agencies. See, like how many goals like can be reached these different agencies, and whatever the green one is saying that it's already being contributed as of last year, like the citizen data started contributed. The yellow ones essentially is all open. Okay, so just to give you a sense of how many things are just open there. Now, of course, you can question their study itself as well. I don't think that's an easy study, but I was very glad to see this kind of work is being done, because it does give you a sense of how many low-hanging fruits is there. So let me use this slogan. I've tried to say these are low-hanging fruits, but really high-stake impact. And I say, there are many things we can do, right? The one thing I will be working with the UN, I already talked to them about, is simply to help them to writing guidelines, how to collect data, right? Because think about say, oh great, all these agencies, all these individual groups want to collect data. Here's our guidelines, like how you should collect data, like a very low-hanging fruits, right? About designing questionnaires, data collection, formatting the data storage, right? And you have these data creations. Now I'm trying to be a little bit like a data scientist, because I learned this term from my information science editors and computer science. Statisticians usually don't talk about data creations and data provenance. I don't know even how to pronounce that word correctly. And so there are many things many things we can do. I think the other thing that's very important is to help on educational and communication materials. You can create this. The one needs most, and I think this is I want to reiterate Liberty's point. Create these good analogy, create things people can understand. I'm going to give one like just next slide. That once you have a good analogy, think about something you say, oh yeah, this is just like something else in life. These are incredibly important when you communicate with citizens. Okay, most of them are non-technical by definition. Okay, so develop these things, collect of them, and and the other thing is important. Develop those in multiple languages. We're talking about reach out to the UN. We're talking about many countries. So I know that our statistical community itself is very international, which is great. And I think we can use, or I still can do some Chinese, so I can help on the Chinese side. I'm sure you guys have all kinds of other languages that even you say, I don't know anything, or take whatever other people do the translation. That's a great help. Translating technical material is a talent. Okay, don't rely on the professional translators to translate these technical materials. They don't know the terms. They will screw up. I had people trying to translate. I had a statistician trying to translate my English piece into Chinese. I cannot really comprehend after the translation. Okay, so I think it's there's another kind of things that ASA can help. That is just think about, in the UN space, that there are lots of technical translations, right? And the statistical terms, machine learning terms. I think that this is very important. Serving a consultant to news media, I think you can help a lot in terms of just explain to them what does these stories means, what does Simpson paradox means, right? So all those things I think will be incredibly important. The other thing I think it has not been emphasized much, and I'm trying to help the UN, and I think ASA can get involved as well. A lot of us, we can help navigating these cultural and social boundaries for analyzing data. I'll give you one vivid example. I used to work with a group of psychiatrists at Harvard. One of their puzzle is they call a depression kind of a paradox. Here's their paradox. They got a lot of survey data from, go to like China, Hong Kong, to do this data. And then they come back to me told me like, so Charlie, there's a paradox here. If you look at these kind of their surveys about major depressions, okay, the rate is extremely low. Okay, these, from these surveys, like, do you have major depression? The extremely low. But on the other hand, the suicide rates are as high as like any other country. So they just could not understand how do you have these China, these Asia countries, they're having kind of a very low depression rate, but then they have a high suicide rate. They just find this cannot really link together. When I look at the data, I said, well, this is very simple explanations, right? And I grew up with that culture. At least by the time I left, it's still that we don't talk about depressions, right? Nobody admit they have depressions because it will be viewed as a weak personality. It's not a disease. It will be viewed as something wrong with you, right? Even the professionals, they don't really say those things, right? So it's a simple, like, you don't ask the question, do you have depressions? They won't report that. Understand the culture will help you like design the question very differently, right? Okay, you don't use the word depression. You can use anything. It's like, are you happy with something or something? You ask this specific question, you can deduce whether they have those things or not, right? But if you just ask the direct question, then you get these. They translate these questionnaire from the U.S. ones to the Chinese ones. Then they got this kind of unsolvable problem, right? So I think that there's a kind of stuff that it's again quite low hanging fruit for those of us who grew up in different cultures, and we do have a very diverse community which can help, right? So, and I think that the other things that we can all do, and particularly there are all these, as time goes on, there'll be more and more these called a citizen data science community will be built. We can serve as these communities, data science advisor. We can serve as a reviewers of whatever the project is doing. We can serve as a project manager. We can even try to, as what I call problem identifier. Here's not only just identify a problem for this group themselves. I actually think about, like, as a statistician, I have identified quite a few problems with working with UN that are coming back to think about as a statistical question, as a methodological challenges, as and all these. Let me just emphasize this one thing that I was thinking about why I think that the refugee and the migrations, all these NGO problems are particularly challenged, right? We all know that doing good statistics, doing good data science, the most important thing is data quality, right? Even without anyone intentionally to conceal the data, collecting good data is already very hard. Okay, we all understand that. But in this NGO space, in this migration refugee space, you will literally have governments, agencies, other country or somewhere that they, for whatever the reason, for wrong reason, right reasons, they may not want to give you the data, or they want to dilute the data. So if you think about that, how hard that is, right? And so you need to think about the data collection is not just like, do I get equal probability sampling, right? That's really mind issue there. That's like, how do I communicate with the people, give them incentive, like like it's very much like a data privacy things, right? How do you do lots of things that you can get the data as you want, or finding a policy ways to make a sense of, at least to know whether data you got has any real value to it or not, right? There are a lot of these issues like a detective job that we statisticians, we know that data quality is important, but we have not really worked on this problem as much as the problem demands. And last but not least, every one of us can become a pipeline builder, by which I mean, education, right? Think about, K to 12, whatever the education you're doing, introducing more examples from the UN's mission. There are tons of examples, data is out there, right? And just think about introducing the kids about bird watching. Well, they would probably never thought about bird watching actually is a data science project, right? And then you ask them to identify, well, what's a possible selection bias, right? Why? How do you collect the data, like when birds are flying around? You can introduce a lot of interesting things that you can not only get the students thinking about the really hard real life problems, but also get them to keep thinking about these really much broad issues that affect our environment, affects our globe. So I think that there are just tremendous opportunity there. So this, I'm not going to talk about this. This was just a simple example. I used this testing soup, this example, as many of you have seen it, that as an example to illustrate to people why you can do take a small sample, infer the gigantic population, very much like you testing soup. As long as you mix well, you don't really need worry about the size of container, right? Issues like I just want people to develop more of these kind of one slides kind of things that it can help a lot in multiple different languages, help the citizen to understand. Oh, I understand. I need to mix well. Otherwise, it's like a soup. I may get just a piece of very salty soup, right? And so my overall slogan, people talk about think globally and act locally. And I think that in this space is really act locally. You can impact globally, and every one of us can contribute. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Xiaoli. Wonderful presentation. We have a couple of chats. Is there a question or two for Xiaoli? I see Karen's raising her hand. Karen, you're fixing to have the floor anyway, but you might as well go ahead with your question.
Xiaoli, who put the UN onto you? Other than the fact that you're famous, what led to the invitation and the involvement? How did I know to call you?
Right. So the UN invitation to give a talk was just coming from this what they call intersecretary group of the UN Statistical Commission. Someone read my article, so they just reached out. Thank you again. Talking about the end of applied statistical impact. Literally, somebody read the article. So they were doing this thing, and then they say, well, we want you to come to speak. And my other connection is entirely through Liberty. Liberty got me into work. Now I
forced him, just like right. I'm asking all the attendees to be involved. So I just made him do it.
Right. So all the refugee, and in terms of refugee and the migration is all Liberty's connection. But the survey part is literally the end of applied statistics. So thanks to you, really.
So glad. Okay. And Xiaoli, would you mind putting the link to that UN video to into?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I can put the link in this.
I think you sent it to me, but
yeah, I will.
For everybody to see.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm done, David.
Well, not quite, but
I mean, other questions.
Do we have time for one or two more questions, either for Xiaoli or Liberty or Scott?
I have a question for Scott, if I'm allowed to go.
Please.
One of the things that I found so fascinating that Xiaoli was talking about was these different cultures of how you ask different questions, for depression, for example. And I know, Scott, you've worked on so many different campaigns, whether it be for the sort of the charitable pro bono work you've done or political campaigns. Have you found ways to sort of ask people questions in ways that make the answers the truth, sort of under this idea of how you get the truth?
Yeah.
In sort of work?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. In fact, the funny thing, it's all the rage amongst public opinion researchers is how do you ask people something that's sensitive, whether it be health related information, whether it be who you're going to vote for, those types of things. And it seems to me, and there'll probably be a couple of minted PhDs off of all this data they've been doing over the last year. But a lot of the questions, or a lot of the way you do it, is you ask in the form of your neighbor. Who do you think your neighbor is going to vote for? If your neighbor had diabetes, or if a close friend or something like that, and they, people, it's funny, words do matter, right? Like question structure does matter. And small changes in a question can really affect some of the public opinion research out there. But the quote unquote cutting edge version is asking what your neighbor, what a close friend, or you think a relative would do. And I think we're getting a lot of that. We're seeing a lot of good responses. There'll be some, it may be proven wrong. But like I said, there's a lot of people who did that in the last year. And they're going to look at a lot of data around that, and someone's going to prove or disprove it. But that seems to be the cool way to do it now.
Good.
That sort of reminds me, how to ask a question. Sort of reminds you that how important it is to test a question before putting it on survey. And as you know, that's why the ASA issued a statement when the Census Bureau wanted to put a question about citizenship, saying it was not adequately tested. It wasn't a matter of, politics, was it right or wrong? ASA was actually promoting its, what they felt was important to promote, which was good science. Which is you have to test these things before you just plow.
Test them and have a debate about order, right? Like I think the biggest problem, and I didn't follow as closely as everyone else, is they wanted to open up the survey with that question, right? Like a question order is I think there would have been less pushback. I'm not saying there'd be no pushback if that were the last question, right? Like after you got all the information and people, that was the last question. I still think there'd be some pushback, and they're probably rightfully so, but like question order is just important. You open up with that question, it's going to affect all of your answers.
Yep.
Nobody's going to
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that was the big thing is like, no one could give me a good answer. And I know a lot of people, at least on the conservative side of things, are answering that is like, okay, I understand why you want the question, but tell me why it needs to be first.
Yeah. Well, look here, we've got a few minutes left, and I want to make sure that we have enough time for Dr. Catheter to provide her closing comments. Everybody, I think, is familiar with Karen. She's the former ASA president from 2019, and it was her impetus that started the discussion about the statistical impact initiative, and thus spawned this particular webinar series. She's a graduate of Stanford University, also of Princeton University, where she worked with the esteemed John Tukey, one of the people who wonderfully had the opportunity to work with Dr. Tukey. She has worked at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. She also worked at Hewlett-Packard. In fact, when she was working at Hewlett-Packard, that's when I met Karen, and she became a visiting scientist at CDC, and we worked together for several months, and she moved on to the National Cancer Institute, also to the University of Colorado at Denver, and now she is the Commonwealth Professor and Chair of the Department of Statistics at the University of Virginia. Many people know her as an editor of some of our most illustrious journals, such as JASA Reviews and Technometrics. I think she's currently associated with the Annals for Applied Statistics. She's been on many National Academy of Sciences committees and an author on many of their reports. And so with that introduction, Karen, why don't I turn it over to you for closing comments? What a wonderful webinar today. And I do obviously thank everybody for all of your comments, Liberty, Scott, and Xiaoming, but let me turn it over to Karen.
Thank you so much, David. And I'll just, this has just been a terrific webinar, and it's because of the speakers and also because of Donna and David Williamson, who have really been devoting a lot of interest to this. I just I'd end real quickly by saying how this series came to be. It, as David mentioned, was one of my initiatives. Fake news being the other one. Geez, if I'd known that Liberty was into fake news, I'd have put her on the initiative. Maybe you're glad you weren't, but that was the other initiative that I had. And also, you know, part of the point of the impact initiative was to remind statisticians that there are many challenges in new areas that we haven't addressed yet. And in my 2019 address, I failed to forecast the pandemic. I did start out with the polio Salk vaccine trial, but I did suggest 2 other areas I thought were of interest, and one was human trafficking, to which this one is related. And I just thought I'd remind you of a column that I wrote on becoming indispensable and maybe something about future plans. I also just can't resist telling a little funny story anecdote here. Shaoli talked about the importance of culture. When my father arrived in this country, December 18th, New York City, December 18th, 1939, 6 p.m., he used to like to say, he took the train to Colorado, where he was going to be a graduate student. And he didn't realize how big the country was. He didn't know how long the train ride was going to be. He didn't have very much money, so he didn't bring any food. Okay, so apparently the couple in his compartment had some food, and they offered some of it to him. Well, in his culture, you always said no the first time. In fact, you always said no the second time, until you found out they really wanted you to have it. Okay, right. And then, well, he learned in a real hurry that strategy was not going to work in America, because as soon as he said no, they didn't ask him again. He said I was starving the whole way. So I have the feeling there's a similar culture in China, because Shaoli immediately
3 times.
Yeah, 3 times. Exactly. That's what Dad said, 3 times. I think the Chinese and the Turks are very close. So how it came to be. So as I say, it seems like other areas jump in before we do. And an example was, big data, where computer scientists seem to be taking it over. This is a true story. My colleague was on a phone call with a computer scientist, and the computer scientist says to him, "Why didn't you guys come up with logistic regression?" No joke. Okay. Oh, so what can ASA do to guide statisticians into new areas? That was kind of the focus of my impact initiative. And knowing that David Williamson has been called into many new areas for statisticians, and recognizing that, as Peter Hall often said, new data problems lead to new research in statistics. I wanted to, have some mechanism where, we were way out ahead in front before, we were the Johnny-come-latelys. I said a happy exception was in evaluating some of the COVID-19 vaccine data and modeling the pandemic. So this was Fauci on the PBS NewsHour. I was so happy to hear him say this that I went to the NewsHour website and wrote it down. She was asking, isn't this approval process going to be, too accelerated and people are going to be worried about it? He said, no. It's not made by us. It's made by an independent group of scientists, vaccinologists, ethicists, statisticians. Okay. So he specifically mentioned statisticians, which I thought was terrific. So I think, as we sort of heard, there are always these preconceived notions of a statistician. And, I really want to know how we can communicate our value without, as Ram Ganadadasakin wrote 30 years ago, coming across as saviors or policemen and policewomen of the scientific world can only hamper our effectiveness. My PhD student now works at Waymo, which is autonomous vehicles. And I said, so what did you find useful? And she said, exploratory data analysis of large sparse data sets, sampling, which we've just heard about, experimental design. And she said, statistical consulting, really any classes requiring presentations have helped in practicing how to best convey information to audiences with a wide variety of backgrounds. So that's relevant to Shaoli's last comment. I actually wrote a column in the AmStat News, the October column, and it's a true story. I woke up at 5 a.m. and Noel King said, this is the star of her story. Picture this. In the early 1950s, a young guy's working at a desk deep inside the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Complains to his wife he has no future there at the Fed. He's not a banker. He's not a lawyer. He's a lowly economist. That's what life was like for economists in the 1950s. She goes on to say that was Paul Volcker. He became one of a small group of economists who made themselves indispensable to US presidents. And the point of my column was, how do we do that? How do we make ourselves? And I think what we've heard from our speakers, Liberty, Scott, and Shaoli, they've given us some ways in which we can become indispensable. So what are some new areas? What's going to be the next webinar? What are the next steps in trying to implement some of the things we've heard today? How do we inspire others? And without overpromising what ASA can deliver, I don't want to put too much on the back of poor Donna Lalonde. I think ASA is very willing to promote good ideas. So if you have them, please send them. And thank you again so much to all of our speakers.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Great webinar. And as Karen and Donna suggested, if you have thoughts about a future impact webinar, please send them along to Donna at ASA or to me at the CDC, and we will see what we can do to set up the next webinar for you. Okay. Thank you all again. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
Donna, you'll be, this recording, it will be posted somewhere, right?
That's
Right.
right. We're building a impact webinar, statistical impact webinar website, and it will be posted on that website.
Okay, great. Thank you
Thank you.
very much. Thank you, Liberty, Scott, and Shaoli. That was
Absolutely.
really
Wonderful.
moving. It was
Yep.
extremely moving and very, very much in line with making an impact. And it's really wonderful to see. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you for having us.